Hello and welcome. I'm Emma Wegner, Associate Educator in Public Programs and Creative Practice at the Met. We're so glad you could join us today for this special Met Speaks lecture with Irene Winter, offered by the Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art. The lecture is made possible by the Friends of Ancient Near Eastern Art and the Ishtar Society. You can turn on live captions by clicking the CC Live Transcript button in your Zoom toolbar at the bottom of the screen and selecting Show Subtitle. Now, to introduce our speaker and to share the agenda for the hour, I would like to welcome Kim Benzel, Curator in charge of the Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art. Kim?
Hello, everyone, and welcome. And thank you, Emma, so much. In fact, I'd like to start by thanking several colleagues for making this event possible, for their support in every way. Emma, you, first and foremost, you're the Associate Curator, Associate Educator, Public Programs. Alex Zilka, the Production Manager for this program. Hannah McHale, Education Program Associate. Mariana Siciliano, Managing Educator of Public Programs. And last but not at all least, a very special thanks to Monica Eisner, who is in our department, the Assistant Administrator. Everyone mentioned went above and beyond to ensure the success of today's program, and for that I am so very grateful. I too would like to thank the Friends of Ancient Near Eastern Art and Ishtar Society members for their enthusiastic and steadfast support for all things related to the Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art at the Met. We could not do what we do without all of you. Before I introduce today's speaker, a little bit about the history and context for this event. The talk was originally planned as part of the programming for the exhibition Rayon Tabet Alien Property, which opened almost exactly 2 years ago to the day. It opened on October 30th, 2019. As we all know, a lot has happened between then and now, and the world has changed dramatically. Among the multitude of things that needed to be rescheduled and rearranged were the exhibition itself, which was extended twice beyond its original closing date, and this talk. The exhibition is now half dismantled and soon to be fully deinstalled, and Professor Winter is presenting her lecture virtually instead of in person, and a year and a half after its original scheduled date, which is all to say that we are thrilled and grateful that it is happening after all. And in a way, it has worked out quite wonderfully. Professor Winter's perspective on Tell Halaf as a scholar of the ancient Near East and archaeology will nicely balance the broader and more contemporary context of the overall project and offer a very fitting close to an incredibly long and very rewarding run of alien property, despite the pandemic, or perhaps because of it. So very briefly, before I introduce Irene Winter, the program will be that Irene gives her talk, Professor Winter gives her talk. I will then come back on towards the end at about 1:50 with a very special guest, Rayon Tabet himself, at Irene's request. They will have a brief conversation, and then we'll open up the floor to questions and answers, and I'll come back to tell you how that happens and introduce Rayon. But now I'd like to introduce Irene. Irene J. Winter was born in New York City, educated at Barnard College in anthropology, received her MA from the University of Chicago in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, her PhD from Columbia University in the History of Art and Archaeology. She has taught at Columbia University, Queens College, CUNY, the University of Pennsylvania, and Harvard University, where she was the William Dorr Boardman Professor until she retired in 2009. She has participated in field excavations at the sites of Godin Tepe and Hassanlu in Iran and at Tel Zakaria in Iraq, with extensive travels in the Near East and Middle East and South Asia, including comparative fieldwork at various sites of Asia. She is a specialist in the art and archaeology of ancient Mesopotamia from the 3rd through 1st millennia BC, with endless publications on literally every aspect of the ancient Near East, a portion only of which is encompassed in 2 volumes of collected essays published by Brill as On the Art of the Ancient Near East. Professor Winter also sits on the visiting committee for our department and is a close and constant collaborator of ours, to our great fortune. It is not an exaggeration to say that Professor Winter has been and remains one of the most important scholars in our field, a formative figure whose impact on the ancient Near East and on all of us who work in the field is nothing short of immeasurable. So with that, it is my great pleasure and my great honor to turn over to Irene Winter for her talk titled Time Present and Time Past, The Many Histories of Tel Halaf, Syria. Thank you, Irene, so much for doing this today.
Thank you, Kim, both for the introduction and for affording me this opportunity to address what I think has been a wonderful show, and all of those who can listen to ruminations on several aspects of the show. You see my chosen title on the screen right now. I call it Time Present and Time Past, The Many Histories of Tel Halaf. Some of you have wondered why, in our idiomatic use of time past and time present, I should, in fact, have called it time present and time past instead of time past and time present. But I did it very purposely on my thoughts that if I did it this way, it's standard Anglophone usage. Nevertheless, it allows us to assume that there's an empirical relationship from time past leading to time present. And what instead I wanted to do was evoke T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets, the very last one called Little Giddings, where Eliot himself played with the relationship between the present and the past that we as art historians have come to recognize, because there is a sense, very real, I believe, that the present influences how we read the past in this intellectual moment. Now, having said that, I would also like to point out where Tel Halaf is for those viewers who may not be as familiar with Tel Halaf as some of the audience will be, where the blue arrow leads to not only the site of Tel Halaf, but the ancient name Bachiani, the land or the tribe of Bachiani, and then the political name of the region, Guzana, so that somewhere between the 10th to the 8th centuries BC, and in fact, starting considerably earlier in the late 4th millennium, the site itself has a long history in relationship to the areas to the east, which have been contemporary Assyria, and areas to the west, which would be the Levant coast, Syria, and Anatolia. I do so because I wanted everybody to recognize that although there is Assyria in my title, the relationship of the modern world with its political boundaries does not necessarily refer to Syria alone, but also to Southeast Anatolia, modern Turkey, where the borders run very close, and also then modern Syria. But I'm going to not stress the modern geopolitical borders, rather the cultural zone in which Tel Halaf was a part. Much of the story has got to be laid at the feet of and has been told by the Baron Max von Oppenheim, who excavated and found the site, then excavated, and then founded the Tell Halaf Museum in Berlin in such a way that we've been able to chronicle the work done at the site and the finds from the site in ways that were early for modern day record keeping. In addition to that, there are at least 2 archival vitrines in the exhibition where not only the Baron Max, but also the great-grandfather of Rayan Tabet, modern contemporary artist, who worked with the Baron Max at the site and helped produce the knowledge that excavation allowed I hope you will have had a chance to see the exhibition itself and ultimately be aware of the depth and wealth of the archival materials preserved both within Rayan Tabat's family and also by the Baron Max himself. Now, for that reason, I also introduce Rayan with a book, Tell Halaf, that has now been translated into a variety of languages, very recently into Arabic, but also into French and German as modern languages, precisely so that there is a sense of the ongoing nature of investigations and publications connected to the site. Now, what I would also point out is that Rayan himself, as a contemporary artist, has had an investment in mounting several iterations of the Tel Halaf material. And it's been interesting to me, maybe this will come up in questions, that different names have been given each time the exhibition is on stage. Alien property being one, orthostats, the flat relief slabs, being another, genealogy being the relationship within family to the knowledge from Tel Halaf being a third, and fragments, the degree to which so many of the works were destroyed and had to be reconstructed and put back together again, as also a passage that we should take into consideration. In addition, in one of the most recent editions of the Tel Halaf volume that began quite early is one that has a frontispiece that you can see in the beginning of the volume that has several statues, sculptures standing on their significant animals, because the pieces that could be put back together again were then brought to the Aleppo Museum, where they have stood in a way to welcome people into the museum, as well as reinvent the history of the site itself from the original architectural setting. Now, it also brings to mind that one of the things I know was on Rayan's mind and has been in all of our minds is the fairly recent civil war that took place with much damage to human life, but also to cultural life in Syria. And consequently, it was a way of keeping the monuments alive in people's memory at the same time as the archaeological materials have been preserved. Now, from that, it made me think of other artists whose work echoes ancient materials from the ancient Near East, included amongst whom Michael Rakowitz, whose Lamassu has stood in Trafalgar Square, London, and in other places, where it turns out, and I'm sure this will interest you, that his genealogy and his lineage as well takes his mother's side of the family back to northern Iraq and Syria, contemporary more or less with major parts of the first millennium BCE of Tell Halaf. In each of these cases, Michael Rakowitz, too, made it relevant not only to his own personal genealogy, but also to the place of lineage in his own identity as he moved through his own contemporary works. But as a further bit of irony and play, it's also the case that at least one iteration of the Lamassu, the winged mishphasin or mixed creature, that is typical and popular in the Syrian world and now in a contemporary world, is that the inlay mosaic of the body of the Lamassu is in fact made up of date syrup cans or tins that become essential, how should I say, supplement to diet in a country, one of whose most important exports has been the date palm fruit and the date palm syrups thereof. Now, in all of these cases, as well as many others, the history of one's family and the history of one's origin becomes an important part of a contemporary artist production. I show you some images now on the right, the lower right, by a contemporary artist, Iraqi artist, who then used the headless gudeyas of Lagash in southern Iraq as a stimulus for modern productivity in the artistic world. And I thank my young colleague, Michelle Marcus, for having made the slide on the right available to me as you see the translation from an ancient sculpture to a more modern piece. Now, this is quite different from modern performative works by contemporary artists. And I wanted to point that out by using someone I knew in New York in the 1960s and 70s, performance artist Yvonne Rainer and filmmaker and dancer. That is to say, I do not think that she was suggesting her own lineage or genealogy coming from the work that she's photographed standing in front of, but rather that as all artists, performance and otherwise, the artists tend to look at works of art in the past and are stimulated by them in their own work. So I would separate out the use of an artist by previous art from the use of an artist through his own or her own genealogy and leave that for us to think about till the end of my presentation, because it has been my experience that all contemporary artists look at arts of the past. In the meantime, I would move us forward to the title was given to that installation at the Metropolitan Museum, much of which is still on exhibit well beyond its running date. And that is the title, Rayan Tabet, Alien Property. Now, many of you who are listening will not be familiar with the notion of alien property as it was dealt with in the United States and some other Western countries in the aftermath or during the course of World War II. The US Office of Alien Property Custodian in 1943 awarded to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York permission to acquire works that had been left by the Baron Max in New York when he went back to Germany. All of these works then were acquired by sale by the Metropolitan Museum and are now in the museum's collection. And this whole question of what constitutes alien property constituted and then acquired during wartime or as a result of wartime is something that we will give some thought to as well. But for our purposes, we do have the Metropolitan Museum archive from 1943 on that records the purchase, but then the exhibition of Tel Halaf reliefs, which have been wonderful for our students and for our scholars, but also wonderful to make available to our wider public. And with that in mind, I take you to just a quick view of the archaeology that has gone on at the site, much of which begins in the very early Uruk period of the 5th millennium BC, but I'm particularly interested in the 1st millennium. You see some of the wall foundations of the excavation, and you also see an excavation photograph that shows us that over the fill and melt and slabs of the walls from the site, the Baron Max was able to uncover rows of slabs of flat orthostats or relief, each of which was sculptured by a separate motif that were then set up as part of the design of the palace at Tel Halaf, somewhere between the 10th, 9th, and 8th centuries BC. Now, in view of that, I would mention that the orthostats or reliefs from Tel Halaf, as they were installed in the facade of a wall and particularly a palace, relate to other sites in the Syria region of northern Iraq nowadays from Nimrud, but also as on the left at the site of Carchemish to the east of Tel Halaf on the Euphrates River rather than on the Habur where Tel Halaf was situated. But this was a standard way of creating a decorative program that spoke to the identity of the site and its history in ancient times. Now, also, one of the things that became apparent as Tel Halaf was uncovered was that the portico building constituting the palace belonged to a category of construction known as the Beit Hilani, the etymology of which is very confused in our scholarship, but Beit meaning the house of can mean tribe as well as house or capital of, the Hilani, which may or may not be related to the Hebrew word for window, chalon, suggesting that the palace entrance facade was comprised of columns, sometimes sculpture, and then a window up on the second story, so that the building itself constitutes a way of representing elite centers of government and palaces in the first millennium BCE. This gray tone is a reconstruction of the Tel Halaf Beit Halani, so that what you will see is precisely the sculptures of the three figures standing on their animals in the entryway above a staircase and a platform that constituted the palace of which one speaks when designating the site. In all of those cases, the reliefs themselves each has a separate motif. A man with a slingshot, a horned animal gazelle, a lion being hunted, another horned animal, a bowman here. That is, there is no clear narrative in the pieces that go together. They are vignettes of similar, unique icons. Another thing I would point out is that there is a row here with post holes in it from wood that has long since eroded, but part of it is related to a typical Syrian, North Syrian, southeastern Anatolian building technique of strengthening brick walls and sculpted walls with horizontal beams of wood at the time of construction. So there is much about Tel Halaf that's woven into a regional tradition of building and decorating before one looks at the site alone. Of those motifs, individual slab by slab, I also wanted to point out that many of the animals' bodies have decoration not only in rib cage, but in a kind of flame pattern on the haunches of the animals that is highly decorative and may or may not relate to the physiognomy of the animal involved, but definitely adds to the decorative surface of display and play on that surface in ancient times. Now, from there, we can move to the exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum. The galleries through which one approached the exhibition shows us the wall with rayon tabet and alien property that I've just mentioned, with the reliefs that belong now in the Metropolitan Museum collection. But when one steps out of the elevator on the second floor, one enters into the archway that also includes the title, Ancient Near Eastern Art, so that the museum has incorporated the Tell Halaf exhibition in a miniature scale into its own time and space. In addition, Rayan himself was able to go to Berlin and do a series of rubbings with the museum permission in order to copy with his own hands and arm the motifs that are on individual slabs. And one of the things I love most about the installation is the way in which the relief slab rubbings have been made into pilasters that stem out into space, and the niche that steps back into it. Again, ways in which that three-dimensional movement rehearses what was shown in antiquity as the reliefs were being excavated. My favorite photograph of all, however, is the view which allows us to see the slabs from the niche we were just talking about on a diagonal into the rear end of one of the major sculptural works from ancient Mesopotamia that are Assyrian of um, about the same to later periods. Now, in pointing that out, one of the things that I would mention is that the lady who was excavated at the site, known sometimes as the Venus, but you'll see I refuse to lay over a classical, much less a Western term of designating her, and just say that it's a sculpture of a female figure, now installed in the Assyrian galleries in front of those very same composite creatures, the lamassus of the Assyrian period that you see in this present slide. Now, what I would focus upon, however, is that when you get up close to her, she essentially is comprised of a reconstruction project that brought together hundreds and hundreds of fragments from a direct bomb hit that took her in 1943 or so of the Tel Halaf Museum, founded by the Baron Max. This is where she was photographed at the site of Tell Halaf, close to the time of excavation. But when she was splintered, she then was brought into the Pergamon Museum in Berlin in order to do the enormous work of joining the pieces, hundreds of them, so that they might be recomprised into the sculpture she once was in antiquity. This is a close-up of how those fragments were reinstalled, and it's mind-boggling to think of the collective work that had to go into it. I also wanted to continue us with not only the fragments of our frontal lady, but also her presence in the gallery in order to remind us how she was able to live in the front facade of the entrance to a building that was then decorated around its exterior surface by these orthostat slabs. Now, another way in which those orthostat slabs are interesting for us is that there were a series of fragments of ivory carvings, as you see on the right, that seem to have the same body decoration as the animal slabs of the stone carvings on the left. They exist under the belly of a sphinx that was one of the animal figures in the facade of the palace at Tell Halaf. And when you compare that to the Assyrian lamassu, basically, I wanted to make the point that the Assyrians never put relief carvings under the belly of a lamassu. They sometimes put inscriptions that are memorials to the ruler, who basically then commissioned the statue for his own immortality, for this immortality of his state, and a dedication to the gods. Now, at the same time, then, what has never been undertaken is a careful iconographic study of the sculptural small reliefs that exist under the belly of the large entry sphinx at Tell Halaf. This is a dissertation topic waiting to happen, and I recommend it to anybody young who has work ahead of them, because it's certainly not something I'm going to undertake myself. But there are motifs of animal combats and of animals themselves that I hope you can see in the slide, with the same winged composite creature on a large scale that Assyrians used, but in a very different way. I would like to know why those sculptural figures are there and what other story they may be telling by virtue of their juxtaposition to the mythological creature at the gateway. When you think about the detail of those mythological creatures, many mythological creatures are deployed at Tell Halaf, including winged demons fighting the very lions whose fragments have already been seen on the ivories. So clearly the Tell Halaf carvers were either copying the ivories in their reliefs, or they're copying the ivory carvings, or they're working with a body of iconography of motifs that had meaning for them that they wanted to impress upon the gallery in a way that the Assyrians did not, by leaving that underbelly blank in other places. Now, part of what this speaks to for us is the Assyrians as their own mindset into which the Tel Halaf lady has been dropped as part of the current exhibition. When you see her in the gallery, she's enormous when you're standing in front of her. The fact remains, however, that when you're up close, you also see, A, that the fragments are very apparent in the reconstruction of her, but B, that her right hand is holding a cup. And that cup or bowl may have been a relationship to a ritual performance, but it may also have been funerary in the incorporation of meaning, where libations are poured and become part of the function of the sculpture in detail. Now, here's one view of it, but here's another where she's close up and you see her hand holding the bowl in the right. But at the same time, it helps us see that something else is going on. And that is that you have a viewscape from the Lady of Tel Halaf to a royal figure of Assyria, or a demonic figure of Assyria, who's also holding a bowl. And I would recommend to you that this was not an accident of installation, that one could read the redundancy from one bowl to the other in the minds of the curators who installed her as a figure. And it does tell us that we are privileged to see this lady in relationship to the Assyrians if one's looking comparatively at more or less contemporaries of the 10th, 9th, 8th century in Assyria. Because those two bowls, if they speak to each other in modern language, may have spoken at each other in ancient times as well. Now, with that in view, I would argue that the placement of Our Lady of Tel Halaf is not necessarily a misplacement into or an invasion of the space of the Assyrian gallery as it stands in the Metropolitan. But I have my own opinions on that, and I will quote another opinion as well later on. I just wanted you to see that that relationship is documented. Here again is a cluster of the reliefs as they were excavated in the time of Sir the Baron Max. And here, the point I wanted to make was that we are looking at a cultural zone that goes from Assyria, Nineveh, and Nimrud, across to the Habur River, where Guzana is located here as river. And that's a tributary of, or to, the Euphrates, where Carchemish that you've seen has been represented. And in all of these cases, the current work of Rayan plays a role, because the dating of Tell Halaf has been up in the air since discovery, from the 12th century to the 11th, to the late 10th, to the 9th. And I think this is far from determined with absoluteness, but it is also the case that there's a very interesting recent article by a colleague, Alessandro Gilibert, on the Tel Halaf Palace and its dating, which is debated, and its history, in a journal few people in our field have heard of, called Cascal, volume 10 of 2013, the reference to which I owe to our own Kim Benzel. I mention it because Tel Halaf is still a work in progress. And as a work in progress, it's also a work in progress, and has been for Rayan as he's mounted his individual iterations, not only of the residue of drawings that he has been able to produce as rollings and rubbings from the Tel Halaf release, but from the volumes dedicated to Tel Halaf. One of the more recent of them is not the German version, but rather the version in Arabic. Now, there, as I had mentioned earlier, the frontispiece of one later volume has the Tel Halaf images installed in Syria, and therefore Rayan's own genealogy is changing as well as he mounts each new show with his sense of what he thinks should be the history of the site. But I have my own story to tell as well, and that is that I had a moment in my own history. A colleague at Queens College in New York walked behind me, put his hand on my shoulder, which people wouldn't do now because I didn't know him very well, and smirked and said, "Yes, but is it art?" And was totally denigrating. You could guess what his field was. It turned out to be Renaissance, Northern Renaissance and Northern Baroque. But I think that in a way, their juxtaposition works with that question, and it doesn't bother me to put the two in the same slide. I will come back to this as I close. But the question of what is art is still being evoked today in the theoretical literature of the ancient Near East in terms of what's propagandistic, what is rhetoric, what is politics, what is art, and how people respond. And that's something I want to come back to as I'm closing. And that is the affective experience of standing in front of the Assyrian works or any works and coming to a decision yourself of the affectiveness of the experience. Sir Max had his own way of doing it, which is to talk about her as my lady or the lady of Tel Halaf. Now, in those ways, I object the same way I objected to the Venus, because precisely what it's doing is relating her to another culture that we value, rather than looking at the intrinsic purpose and function of the work in its own times. And it's also implying a kind of intimacy that many archaeologists have gone through of claiming the work that they find as theirs rather than belonging to the culture. So let us then put Our Lady back into the galleries where the lady from Halaf is now installed and will be for a while. When faced with the lamassus of Tel Halaf, of Assyria, they can be shown in photography as precisely whether or not and how they are in conversation with each other. But I would argue that depending on the vantage point of a photograph, you can change that story through the use of photography. So when she's in conversation with the lamassus, they are on a scale more or less relating to each other. However, when you take a slide and an image where the Assyrian is staring at the Tel Halaf figure, it almost looks as if the Assyrians were dominating the sculpture of Tel Halaf. And if you take it from a distance view between the lamassus of Assyria, it looks like somebody's created a generic, dramatic photograph, again, historically dominating as opposed to in conversation. In my view, the best possible way to look at this material is in a multiple vantage point that includes the scholar, the historian, the family of Rayan, for which the best possible narrative is made in the Metropolitan Bulletin of the fall of 2019 that includes essays by Kim, by Rayon and by Claire Davis that tells the more complex story, that takes things from discovery through World War II to the present day. And my appreciation to the curators and Rayon for having produced this invaluable bulletin so we can all learn from their scholarship. What I would do to close then is ask you and leave you with 3 questions. What is a good installation? And here, it's a museum conversation and a communication act with the people who come to the museum. I would ask you how one deals then with the identity and personal history of the artist, plus the times, because I made my title not only from T.S. Eliot, but also from the philosopher Nelson Goodman, who shifted the conversation to the maker and the audience by calling the usual art historical question, what is art? Rather, instead, when is art, at least in our culture? And finally, my 3rd question, which is the Queen's College question today, and that is, but, is it art? This brings up a global conversation, especially in conversation with the pandemic and how art and focus have been changing in our lifetime in the last 2 years toward a very new normal, if you will. And that is a much broader notion of what is being accepted as high art for its own time, even if we claim difference in judgment and difference in value. So here I leave you, and I'm open now to Kim, to Rayon, to questions, and to where we go from here.
Irene, thank you so very much. You added such important layers to both the Tell Halaf story, narrative, history, and to the alien property one. So it's a perfect full circle for the project, and, you know, of course, so important for our field that we love. So I lots to say, but I can tell you, you and I can have all the conversations we want. I'd like to now, as we mentioned earlier, welcome our special guest, the special guest that you requested, Irene, Rayon Tabet.
You make me sound, I want you to all look at the front of the Metropolitan Museum bulletin of Rayon's great-grandfather. And don't they look alike? What do you think, Rayon? Don't you resemble your great-grandfather? I do. Anyway, go ahead.
It was great. Yeah, you know, I had never noticed that until you pointed it out. I agree. So I'm going to briefly introduce Rayon, who will also appear on screen in a minute. Rayon is, of course, the artist at the center of Alien Property, the project, and multiple iterations thereof in other places and venues. He lives and works between Beirut and San Francisco. Drawing from experience in self-directed research, Tabet explores stories that offer an alternative understanding of major socio-political events through individual narratives. Informed by his training in architecture and sculpture, his work investigates paradoxes in the built environment and its history by way of installations that reconstitute the perception of physical and temporal distance. Recent solo shows of his include Deep Blues at the Walker Art Center, Alien Property at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Exquisite Corpse at the Sharjah Art Foundation, and Arabesque at the Storefront for Art and Architecture here in New York. On a very personal note, I'd like to say that it was an exceptionally eye-opening and edifying experience to work with and learn from Rayon during the development of Alien Property. Rayon, thank you for coming back in these last days of the project to join Professor Winter today. So I'll turn over to the two of you, and then I'll come back. We'll, have a little chat, and then I will start feeding you some questions from our audience, if I may. So to that point, before I turn over to you, I'd like to say to the audience that there's no live sort of raising hands and coming on, but if you probably all know this by now, at the very bottom of your Zoom screen is a button that says Q&A. Please feel free to put in any questions you have. And if it's for a particular, either Irene or Rayan, specify, please, and I will then, funnel them to the two speakers. So Irene, back to you, and Rayan.
Thank you, Kim, for the introduction, but and for the show, and for these crazy years we've spent working on this together. And really, thank you, Professor Winters, for taking the time and really going in a deep dive on the subject matter of the show, but really kind of taking up the kind of the contemporary aspect and a lot of the details and care that all three of us, Kim, Claire, and I, you noticing every single kind of gesture and doing it justice is really wonderful. And it was great to hear you speak about those and your interpretation of them. And maybe to kind of walk us in or walk us through, I always say this anecdote when I talk about this project, and I think it's particularly important today to reiterate. When I approached several of the museums that had in their collection objects from Tel Halaf, I always used the same strategy. I never told any of them that I was an artist because of personal reasons, but most importantly, because we know that a lot of classical institutions or encyclopedic things, places that are known as universal encyclopedic museums might have issues with contemporary artists taking on the history of their objects. And I always presented myself as the great grandson of somebody that had worked on the dig, and that I would be like, oh, I have a few photographs and some material from the dig. Could I just show them to you and start a conversation with you? And that process was followed almost to the T with Kim here and with the institution. And slowly then I would reveal my intentions, which was and I would then say could I, I'm actually also an artist. Could I make a rubbing of this object? And then afterwards could I make a performance in this space? And then, then the kind of projects would grow. And then Kim came and she's like, okay, well, now maybe we should do a show, or maybe we should do a publication. And I think it's important to note this, to think together about the idea of these multiple voices and the multiple kind of hats a person can wear. I can be simultaneously the great grandson of somebody that had worked on this dig, and I could also be kind of an artist in my own right. And that these multiple voices or these different approach were also at the center, became at the center of our conception as a collaboration between a contemporary artist, a curator in charge of ancient Near East art, and a curator in modern and contemporary, that we also had to maybe switch hats, exchange hats, and that in the display strategy, there was a clear decision that was made that there would be no focus on one particular object, that the legal material pertaining to how the Met acquired the objects would stand side by side to the paraphernalia that were more personal objects from my great-grandfather. The artwork that I produced was equal to the artifacts themselves. And so my question to you, Professor Winters, because you brought up at some point also scholarship, do you feel that today it is possible for that kind of an approach, a polyvocal approach, a kind of often contradictory approach, because these voices don't all work in unison, to enter something like academia, or to enter a place that is, has long maybe either separated fields from each other or not maybe allowed for this kind of multiple voices to happen. And, a lot of times I feel like in the contemporary, as a contemporary artist, I'm allowed and I'm able to do these kinds of jumps temporally, spatially, and even in curatorial practices, curators are able to kind of do these nimble things. I've yet to see the full extent of that nimbleness enter scholarship. So I just kind of wanted to see if those kinds of attitudes how they could enter back into your field, and if they could start troubling some of these questions and concerns that you kind of raised in part, maybe the hegemony of the classicists and the hegemony of a, let's say, Eurocentric narrative around art history.
Well, it's a penetrating question, and there isn't an easy answer to it, but it's a question that's been floating, I believe, since the 70s in terms of changes in art historical theory and practice. So I've welcomed it precisely because of the anthropological training I had, not just the standard traditional art historical focus on Western art. But we used to have to fight to have the ancient Near East included in any kind of encyclopedic museum, plus any encyclopedic text where people wanted to just begin art with the early Greeks. And or you tipped the hat to something in the caves, and then you went on to the Greeks. So the fight has been going on to have a better and broader view of history. But I also wonder how you feel as an artist. I think that for me, the pandemic has broadened that domain, visual domain as well. I've been so moved and so surprised at the change in race, color, gender of advertisements on television since the pandemic, because of the rhetoric around racial subtexts and cultural subtexts, even to the availability of vaccines. We cannot separate ourselves from a current moment that we have lived through that has not happened before and to quite this extent. And that rhetoric, I think, has impacted significantly on the new normal of what will be art historical inquiry, but maybe also even on what is contemporary artistic production. It will not be as lily white in the gallery scene as it has been, and it will not have been as tied to exclusionary rather than inclusionary models of whatever theme is being put forward. So in that respect, the pandemic may have done some good for us to allow us to rethink the borders and boundaries of our enterprises collectively. I am left wanting to know, what do you do when you're not working with Tel Halaf materials as an artist? Do you have a whole productivity that is yours in pencil to paper or ink to paper or oil to canvas? Or have you made Tel Halaf your career? And I have no party pre with how you would answer it, but I do want to know how you see yourself as a contemporary reinscriber of history as well as inscriber of art.
Yeah.
Can I interrupt 1 second? Rayan, if I may ask, if you could keep your response brief so we can get to a couple of audience questions. We do have some. So, sorry.
Yeah, of course. Quick note that, Tel Halaf, I came to it because of this familial connection. It is one of the kind of axes and stories that narratives that I think I will continue on kind of looking through. But ultimately, the practice has always been concerned with locating myself in relation to certain objects, and by kind of deep diving into their biography and history, try and kind of reconstitute the world. So, and that might range from an Eames chair to a Halaf relief.
Good answer. So thank you both, but don't go away. I am going to field as many. We have, quite a few questions already, and I'll take them in the order that they came in. So the first one, I think, is very clearly for you alone, Irene, but sure, Rayan, take a stab if you want. The question is there any thought as to the individual mythical animals on the slabs? Might they be symbols of prominent persons or clans?
If there were not so many of them, they could be. I would have no problem with their having some individuation reference point, but I see no evidence for it, either in foundation texts or in historical statements that were contemporary with the buildings, whether Assyria or Tel Halaf. I see the only voice that is articulated grammatically is that of the ruler, who is the mastermind of the construction. So I have no problem as long as something is a hypothesis, if one then distinguishes a hypothesis from a potential conclusion without evidence, and then pursues it at a scholarly level through supportive research, evidence.
Well, I mean, to your point of hoping that there are more dissertations forthcoming on some of the iconography. I was like, bingo. So another question, which I think is for you, it is certainly for you, Irene, and it has to do with the timing of the Silk Road in relation to Tel Halaf.
Wait, the timing of
the Silk Road period and any influence with Tel Halaf.
The Silk Road, this I owe to Karen Rubinson, but she found the first Chinese bronze or whatever on the Silk Road in the 7th century BCE. As far as I know, she documented it, and it's not my period. But the Silk Road to me is a later phenomenon. It doesn't surprise me, however, that the east-west routes that are coming from Central Asia on the one hand and or from South Asia or further east on the other are moving through a similar pathway that Tel Halaf occupied and then moved on to the coast and Mediterranean trade. That's the point at which, again, one has to deal with chronology, as someone I know is wont to say, because that's the point precisely, as if you can hypothesize anything, but if you can't annihilate some competing hypotheses and create an argument for ranked variables, then you can't get any further than just a long list of possibilities. And as long as the Silk Road is using a well-known route, then sure, the roads stay the same. The Achaemenid road through Anatolia was no different from the road we drive today on a way to an archaeological site in eastern Turkey. So that's the point at which there are natural phenomena, and that's the point at which historical geography enters into the question, and roads enter into it, because once determined, a road is likely to stay in use. But again, I'm only willing to entertain it as an understood hypothesis and then document it if possible.
Thank you. It's 2:00. Emma, may I take one more question from the audience? Even if we go over by a minute or two?
Sure. I think so.
Okay, but one more. We have a few others, which I'm sorry we may not get to, but happy to try and answer in a chat form. So the next question is a statement and a question. Greatly enjoying Professor Winter's talk. Viewed Rayan's video as I did not get to attend the exhibition. Surprised to see the Lamassu guardian figures installed in a standoff, in quotes, position to the Lady of Tel Halaf. So I think that's probably more for you, Rayan, for all of us who worked on the show, but I'm going to turn that. We had a lot of discussion about exactly that. So I'm sending that your way, Rayan.
I mean, the reading of it as a standoff is also, again, has to do maybe with the viewer's perspective. For us, there was or at least for me, I was first really interested in placing, we were all interested, but me particularly, in the institutional critique potential of placing an object in a room that almost, and correct me if I'm wrong, Kim, has, I think, never had an object besides the Court of Assyrian Relief itself placed there. I was interested in the potential of thinking of this as an active gallery rather than a passive space. And what was then interesting when the seated figure arrived from Germany, and while we were installing it, all three of us, Claire, Kim, and I, were started realizing the multiple layers, both historical, political, and contextual of that placement, far beyond it as just an object in space. One being this kind of what we're going to call a confrontation. That's very also, these are two humanoid figures that are looking at each other. These are figures that have been also maybe attributed to two different genders that are also looking at each other. These are two figures that come from what could be considered a high culture and a low culture looking at each other. And these are two figures that, so there is, but these are two figures that also share a lot in common. And then that what we're going to call a confrontation might be generative. So to think together of the generative potential of those kinds of placements, that might be not follow the rules of curatorial practice, the rules of even an ancient Near East condition that is also inherited. I think the centrality of the Court of Assyrian Relief and the importance that these objects have in the history of the department itself is, of course, should be talked about and accentuated, but that does not mean that it should set aside other objects. And I think that that placement then maybe reinvigorates or triggers a series of conversations. And so, again, I don't want to speak on behalf of you, Kim, or Claire's intentions, but I really now, with 2 years looking back, I think I would really stress that sometimes these kinds of gestures go even beyond our intentions, and that they trigger a set of conditions and problems and questions and contradictions that we should take on particularly. And I just would end by saying that I think the world outside of the museum is already there. So it's important that the museum catches up with academia, which is already there, and definitely the rest of the world, which has far surpassed all of us.
Thank you so
Irene,
much.
I'm going to turn to you. Sorry, I was just going to turn to you. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I thank you so much. I just need to say that one of our colleagues called putting her in that gallery a travesty because she interrupted the possibility of scrutiny and relationship to the Assyrian materials. I didn't and don't even now, but I do need to say out loud that the spacing in the Assyrian gallery before she was dropped in was precisely the width of the throne room of Ashurnasirpal II, whose reliefs are along the walls, as 10 meters across. Now, if that's the case, then the possibility of relating to that space as an Assyrian would, by being dwarfed by the scale of the Assyrian reliefs, is gone, while one accepts and even celebrates the generative potential of the Lady of Halaf in the middle of that space. So that she's a temporary exhibit, I have learned, can give us greater freedoms because it gives us that generative possibility to see that relationship. Were she to stay there forever, then she does change the ability to relate to the Assyrian lamassus and the Assyrian reliefs as if it were an Assyrian palace. And then I would ask Kim to talk more with her team about where else she might be in the museum.
This has been wonderful. We will do that, and it is a very big difference between a temporary exhibition and a
Exactly.
permanent, impermanent gallery condition. So it's a really valid point, and we would do different things in those two different situations. But we are out of time, and I'm going to apologize. There are more questions in the chat that we're already 7 minutes over, so I'm obliged to say goodbye to everyone who joined us today, to thank the amazing Met team from education and Ancient Near East who made this all happen, to thank Rayon so much for joining the conversation, and Irene, to thank you a million times over for coming and making this sort of essentially the close to alien property and just a really tremendous one. And thank you. It was a great hour and a few minutes. So thanks.